On June 22, 2005, in the pre-dawn hours, the Los Angeles police responded to a dispatcher's report of a hit-and-run involving a bicyclist in a dark alley. The driver of the car had fled the scene. When officers arrived at the specified location, they found a man lying in the dark alleyway. He was dead. His bicycle was standing next to him. It appeared that the man had stopped to pump up a flat tire on his bicycle when he was hit by a car whose driver hadn't noticed him. But there were several issues. Firstly, the bicycle tire was not flat, so why would he stop to pump it up? Secondly, literally a few steps away from him, a streetlight was on, but he chose to do this task in the dark. Thirdly, he had no tools. Additionally, he was covered in motor oil, and there was a tire mark on his jeans, indicating that the car had completely run over his body. This was unusual because a car typically either pushes the victim to the side or the victim tumbles over the car and falls. Finally, the autopsy would later show that when the man was hit by the car, he was not sitting or standing but lying on the ground. His chest had been crushed, 3 ribs were broken, his spine was fractured, and he had been dragged about a meter, causing injuries. Furthermore, a strong sleeping pill and an equally strong painkiller were found in his system. Why would a man go for a bike ride after taking such medications? Fortunately, there were no problems identifying the man. Thanks to documents found on his body, he was quickly identified as 50-year-old Kenneth McDavid. When the officers went to Kenneth's last known address, they arrived at an apartment building where the manager informed them that Kenneth hadn't lived there for some time. Kenneth was a musician. He played the piano, and in his hometown of Sacramento, he worked as a DJ. He moved to Los Angeles to try to find work as a screenwriter. He was unsuccessful, had no job, and couldn't pay the rent, so he left the apartment. However, the manager knew where Kenneth had gone next. He had been visiting a soup kitchen for homeless people at a local Presbyterian church, and a kind, elderly woman, who also attended the church, had taken it upon herself to help him. But before trying to find the woman, the police focused on another important lead. A surveillance camera from a store located near the crime scene captured a car driving down the alley where the man was killed. The car stopped for a few minutes. The driver turned off all the lights, then after a few minutes turned them back on and drove away. The car was either a Ford Taurus or a Mercury Sable station wagon. Around the same time the investigation into Kenneth McDavid's murder began, insurance investigator Ed Webster was examining claims for payouts on 2 policies that struck him as curious. They were for about $1 million, and both were in Kenneth McDavid's name. Since the policies were less than 2 years old, they triggered an automatic investigation by the company. Ed didn't like the fact that almost all the information provided in the policies was incorrect. The beneficiaries were listed as 2 women, Kenneth's fiancée and his cousin. However, when Ed reviewed police reports about his death, he learned that these same women had told investigators they were his business partners. The investigator tried to contact the women, but they didn't return his calls, didn't answer the door, and didn't want to communicate. Considering that a simple conversation with him was all that stood between them and $1 million payout, the investigator suspected something was amiss and contacted the police. By an incredible coincidence, Ed's conversation with one of the investigators on the case was overheard by another detective sitting nearby. The facts discussed by the men seemed strikingly familiar to him, down to the smallest detail. After some digging, he found an old file on the unsolved case of Paul Vados, and after rereading the case materials, the detectives realized that this couldn't be just a coincidence. On November 8, 1999, the Los Angeles police responded to a 911 dispatcher's report of a hit-and-run. The driver had fled the scene. The victim turned out to be an elderly man. His lifeless body was found in an alleyway. When the officers arrived at the scene, they were stunned by what they saw. Judging by the man's injuries, he wasn't standing or walking when he was hit. Instead, it seemed he was lying on the ground and didn't even try to stop the car from running over him. He had no identification on him, and it took some time before he was identified as 73-year-old Hungarian immigrant Paul Vados. The man was a widower suffering from depression, which led him to live on the streets. Despite the strange details surrounding his death, when investigators established Paul's identity and found out he had no fixed address, they concluded that he had passed out in the alley when the car ran over him. They didn't abandon this conclusion even when the autopsy found no alcohol or drugs in his system. The police learned that Paul had been reported missing by his fiancée and cousin. The fiancé claimed his body from the morgue, and the cousin came to the station to request a death certificate. Surprisingly, neither woman seemed overly distressed by the man's sudden death. Usually, when relatives collect a death certificate from the police, they want to know how their loved one died. Typically, this is a difficult and lengthy conversation, but not this time. Despite the strange behavior of Paul's relatives, due to the lack of surveillance cameras or witnesses at the crime scene, investigators had nothing to go on. Unfortunately, the case was quickly forgotten. Only when the investigators compared the materials from both cases, Kenneth McDavid's and Paul Vatos's, did the first pieces of the puzzle start to come together. It turned out that the so-called fiancé and cousin who received the insurance payouts after Kenneth's death were the same women who had claimed Paul's body and his death certificate in 1999. Their names were Helen Golay and Olga Rutterschmidt. Both women were over 70. They had taken out around a dozen insurance policies on men and, after their deaths, were set to receive more than $4 million. The insurance companies had only paid out $2.2 million so far. Moreover, detectives could not find any evidence that the women were actually related to the deceased. So where had they crossed paths with them? Possibly in the Hollywood Presbyterian Church, which they had already heard about from Kenneth's apartment manager. The pastor confirmed that Helen and Olga had been attending the church since 1997. He described them as wonderful women. They participated in the church's program that provided food to the homeless and greatly helped those in need. Helen was involved in real estate and used some of the houses she owned to provide shelter to those in need. It was at the church that the women met Paul and Kenneth. The picture was becoming clearer. Detectives were almost certain that Helen and Olga were behind both murders. They had committed the crimes to obtain as much money as possible from the insurance policies taken out on the men. However, while the police were conducting their investigation, they discovered to their horror that the women had already found a new victim. Suspecting Helen and Olga of murder, the police set up surveillance on them. Officers saw Olga stop at the sidewalk and start talking to an elderly man who was out for a walk. The man was a Hungarian immigrant named Joseph Gabor. Olga and Joseph had apparently met before, as the man confidently got into her car and they headed to a bank. Officers watched as the pair entered the bank and approached a teller window. On the way out, Olga threw some papers into the trash and the officers quickly retrieved them. These were envelopes with return addresses from an insurance company and a bank. Detectives concluded that the women planned to kill Joseph just like they had killed Paul and Kenneth. Fearing they didn't have much time before this actually happened, in May 2006, the police arrested Helen and Olga on charges of insurance fraud. Although they had no evidence to charge them with murder yet, they conducted searches of the women's homes. It turned out that Helen, in particular, kept detailed records, and when the police searched her house, they found documents linking her to Paul, Kenneth, and a third man named Fred Downey. Fred was 97 years old when he agreed to move from his home in Massachusetts to Los Angeles, where Helen could take care of him. Helen gained control over his finances and his home. Soon after his bank accounts were emptied, Fred died under the wheels of a car in November 2000 when he wandered out into the street in a semi-conscious state. The case was ruled an accident. In addition to Helen's records, detectives found 8 rubber stamps with facsimile signatures of Kenneth, Paul, and other people. They also found a sedative and analgesic, substances that were also discovered in Kenneth's body at the time of his death. However, the most significant clue was provided by Helen herself. Someone impersonating Helen Golay called a towing company a block away from Kenneth's murder scene. The call was made an hour before the body was discovered. The caller requested to tow a 1999 Mercury Sable station wagon, and the car's number was found in Helen's records. The car was towed to Helen's home and then abandoned nearby. The car was confiscated for numerous parking violations and was resold when no one came for it. At the time of the incident, the car was registered to a woman from Encino, whose name was found on a scrap of paper when the police searched the car. However, it turned out that this woman was a victim of identity theft, and the car never actually belonged to her. Fortunately, the police managed to track the car, and when they conducted a thorough search, they found that there was still blood on it. The blood belonged to Kenneth. The police were still investigating the murders of Paul and Kenneth when, on May 19, 2006, the informants were charged with 8 counts of fraud. It was sensational news. 2 elderly women, who might have been at home knitting socks or reading detective novels, were found to be planning the murders of unsuspecting men. When news of the arrest of both women became public, journalists and the community actively discussed the case. It was at this point that a man named Jimmy Covington came forward. His story only convinced the police that they were on the right track. Jimmy recounted that in the early 2000s he was going through tough times and was sleeping on the street behind a church. When he was once again chased away by a security guard, Olga noticed him. The woman fed Jimmy and made him an offer that he, a man who wanted to find work and dreamed of a normal life, could not refuse. Olga promised Jimmy a place to live and additional help if he agreed to fill out several forms. She described this as a kind of charitable program to help people who had fallen on hard times get back on their feet. He accepted the offer, but Olga and Helen immediately began asking him very personal questions. They wanted to know everything, including his social security number and whether he had any relatives. Suspecting something was wrong after just a few days of the so-called charitable program by Helen and Olga, Jimmy decided to decline their offer of help and go his own way. Of course, he could not have known that by that time the informants had already secured 2 insurance policies on him. They did the same with Kenneth and Paul, but none of them suspected the horrific scheme. On July 31st, 2006, Helen and Olga were charged with the murders. The women were held without bail in federal prison. They could have been sentenced to death, but the prosecutor stated that they would not seek the death penalty for the women. The trial began on March 18, 2008. At the same time, the prosecutor dropped the fraud charges. If the women were acquitted of the murder charges, these fraud charges could be used later. The prosecutor told the jury about Helen Golay and Olga Rutterschmidt. The women were not married, but enjoyed dressing stylishly and visiting places where they could meet many men, such as fitness centers and churches. Helen worked as a real estate broker, owned several properties, and lived in a $1.5 million house in a very prestigious neighborhood, driving a Mercedes SUV. In other words, she was a wealthy woman who had no need to turn to crime. However, she had not always been wealthy. After her father's death in a car accident, she had lived in foster care. She earned money not only through real estate but also by blackmailing her tenants, overhearing their secrets, and suing anyone who got in her way. Her philanthropy was a front. She despised those less fortunate in life. Olga had moved to the USA from Hungary, lived in a small apartment, drove a Honda Civic, and had no obvious source of income other than working as a realtor for Helen. Previously, she and her husband had owned a coffee shop. Unlike Helen, who maintained her appearance with plastic surgeries, Olga was very athletic for her age and loved long walks. It was unknown how the women met, but it was clear that it had been many years ago. The women had little in common and did not socialize as friends in everyday life. But meeting many years ago and understanding what they both wanted out of life, they served as justifications for each other, feeding each other's desire to rob and kill people. They found homeless men whom they offered housing, clothing, and food in exchange for signing just one insurance policy, or possibly another document. This allowed the informants to make facsimile signatures and, without the victim's knowledge, secure as many insurance policies as their consciences would allow. They took out 12 policies on Paul and 23 on Kenneth. After Paul and Kenneth's deaths, they claimed the insurance payouts as their only close relatives. However, Paul Vados had a close relative, a daughter named Stella, who had not been in contact with her father for several years. When she learned of his death, she engaged in a difficult battle to have his body moved to the family burial site and to claim the insurance payout. For 2 years, Helen and Olga provided food, housing, and clothing for the men. During this time, they learned who the men associated with, if they had relatives or friends. It was an investment on their part, and they were too old to wait for the men to die of natural causes. Why did they give themselves exactly 2 years? If a person dies within a 2-year period after an insurance policy is issued, the insurance company automatically initiates an investigation. However, after 2 years, companies rarely do this. It is unclear how the informants miscalculated in Kenneth's case, but Ed took on the investigation. In Kenneth's case, McDavid was drugged with strong analgesics and sleeping pills, combined with alcohol, placed in the car, and driven to a dark alley in a vehicle registered to a fictitious person. In the alley, they turned off the headlights, removed the man from the car, backed up, and slowly ran over David, as if intending to cause severe injuries. In reality, the car moved so slowly that the man's glasses stayed on his head and were covered in oil. Afterwards, the women turned on the headlights and drove away. But during the murder, the car broke down. It traveled another block before it had to be abandoned. Helen then called to have the car towed. The police initially thought they had hired someone to commit the murder because they could not believe that two older women of fragile physique could carry out such a scheme. As if the evidence was not enough, Olga and Helen incriminated themselves almost immediately after their arrest. The bombshell effect was caused by a recording of the women's conversation at the station. When they refused to talk to the detectives, they were left in the interrogation room. Unaware that they were being recorded, Olga immediately began scolding Helen for her greed, repeatedly saying that she did not need to take out so many insurance policies. In the spring of 2008, 78-year-old Helen and 75-year-old Olga were found guilty of first-degree murder of Paul Vados and conspiracy to murder both Paul Vados and Kenneth McDavid. Helen was also convicted of first-degree murder of Kenneth. Both were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. They are now in prison, with Helen being 93 years old and Olga 91 years old. Unfortunately, Fred Downey's murder remains unsolved. His case is particularly tragic because it was clear how much he loved and trusted Helen. He even bought a headstone for her and her daughter so that they could be buried beside him after their deaths. Based on Fred's case and the information provided by Jimmy Covington, it is reasonable to assume that the women might have had other victims. It is terrifying to think about, but Olga was right. If the women had not taken out so many insurance policies, no one would have suspected them. That was their fatal mistake. Helen and Olga appeared to be kind women, opening their hearts and wallets to those less fortunate in life. In the City of Angels, the two women seemed to be angels sent from heaven, but in reality, they were the offspring of much darker forces. The women's crimes were more than just murders. Over 2 years, they closely interacted with these men, cared for them, and yet showed no sympathy or compassion. They merely waited coldly for the right moment to kill them and collect the money.